Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly so.
Thank you. Okay, I prefer POIs in the chat, but you can also maybe wave. I might be able to see you that way as well. Okay. Problem with that Prime Minister's speech is that it assumes that the kinds of depictions of mortal salience will happen in a very good way, in which the media depicts death in a very objective way, in a very caring way that makes people make good decisions about their lives. But this is unfortunately untrue. And just like the PM wanted to criticize things like depictions of random and gruesome deaths, those things are still likely to happen, except maybe the character that it's just hacked someone to death in a movie says, like death is inevitable anyway, and that we should all appreciate that. So the media is the media, and it will likely remain so no matter whether or not mortal salience is the point. Two arguments. First of all, why this broadly makes people unhappy, and that is super bad. And second of all, why this leads to really bad life decisions that not only impacts the individual, but also impacts the society. First of all, why this makes people unhappy. The first thing under this is that no matter how this is done, even if it's done the perfect and unrealistic way that PM wanted to depict it as, it makes people a lot more unhappy. This is because the fear of death means that thinking about death at all is intensely discomforting. This is because, one, humans are biologically programmed to fear death. Literally all of us Homo sapiens have survived past other kinds of humanoids because we have been able to avoid death more. This is why humans have intense fear of death, and that is why we do things like risk avoidance in daily lives. But second of all, we have an intense fear of our loved ones, especially in our very modernized contemporary society. We have so many things and we own so many things in life, and that makes losing all of these things upon death extremely, extremely scary. But third of all, there are just social messages about the beauty of life, right? Everywhere in our lives, we see messages about how life is super good and we should be super thankful for our lives. And that is why death is going to be intensely fearful, regardless of the messages around death. So the government side might say, okay, if we just talk about death loads in the media, there's going to be desensitization. But actually, desensitization is not possible. First of all, it's really, really hard to deprogram our brains from the evolution that we experience. No matter how much desensitization happens in the media, we're probably still going to intensely fear death. But second of all, the depictions of death is unlikely to be the ones that are particularly good at desensitizing people, because the depictions of death will likely be extremely shocking. And that is going to be my second point here, which is that media will depict death in a sensationalized manner. This looks like sneaking death into everything, including not just the really serious conversations about euthanasia, but also in things like movies or TV shows where characters randomly die of accidents. Second of all, deaths are likely to be particularly shocking. And third of all, there's likely going to be death depicted in contexts that are adjacent to death anyway. So for example, when there's a piece of healthcare news that is originally unrelated to death, death will probably appear in that kind of healthcare news as well. Why would the media likely to do this? Firstly, is that when the debate is about increasing the salience of death, the thing that gets people's attention is probably going to be depictions of death that are particularly shocking, because media operates in a networked way, right? If one piece of media is extremely shocking, then other pieces of media are going to report on it, and that is how you get more salience. Second of all, shocking things just get more discussions and money. Media still operates in a capitalist system, even under their side. This means that when media depicts death, it's going to do so in a very sensationalized manner. But third of all, there's going to be a competition and the race to the bottom. If all media is trying to increase the salience of death, then the media is going to get the most eyes on it if it is the most sensationalized. This is going to be extremely bad because it makes the fear of death far, far worse when you see death coming at you at random places in an extremely gruesome manner. But second of all, it's extremely bad for people who already have things like trauma. Third of all, media is going to emphasize bad types of deaths. This looks like deaths that are accidental and at any age, and like just like random person working in a construction site and having like a brick fall on their head and killing them. Why is this likely the case? Because first of all, natural death is not very sensational and bad for engagement and diversification, right? If the media wants to talk about death and how it's very salient, if they only talk about the deaths that happen like on the deathbed when you're 89 years old, that is one, a small portion of death that humans experience, but two, like not very nice and like not very something that people want to see because it's not very interesting. But second of all, ageism means that people generally don't want to see a bunch of old people in their media, which means that the likely kinds of depictions of death are going to involve young people, which then makes people, one, like constantly fear death even at a young age and feel like they're preparing to death at any time, but suddenly also being confronted with that fear of death constantly within their lives, even though they're not old. But lastly, under this point, death narratives in media, if not in like a capitalist media that is very sensationalist and clickbaity, probably going to be captured by conservative institutions such as religion. This is also really bad because like institutions such as religion have a very narrow definition of what constitutes a good death. They'll probably emphasize things like selective admissions to better versions of the afterlife, which means that the media is going to be oversaturated with messages about the afterlife, which is very exclusive to people, for example, LGBT communities or other people whom that afterlife is inaccessible. This is better on our side because media doesn't constantly remind people of death and because there are fewer sensationalist descriptions, enabling people to like choose when they want to access information about things like death planning and euthanasia, enabling much better engagement. CG.
If you are correct, it is always profitable to report on death. This is uncharitable. This narrative is different than just showing that happens, but rather analyzing why it's inevitable and doing more complex things than what you suggest.
No. It's not always profitable to report on death. It is your side that is defending more reporting on death. We're just saying that all kinds of reporting about all kinds of topics are probably going to be sensationalized, and sensationalized death more is bad. Second of all, why this makes people make bad decisions. Obviously, people have different reactions to media. And in the case that they're still engaging with the media, they probably have a combination or one of the following reactions. First of all, they could have a nihilistic reaction because death is so scary and feels so bad. They probably want to numb that sense of fear, and it triggers a like it doesn't matter anyway kind of reaction, right? This essentially is a type of desensitization that is quite bad. This is likely to happen because this already happens with other things that people are overexposed to in the media. For example, things like sex. Why is this bad? Because this decreases empathy and long-termism, and is like actually worsens things like end of life planning, because people think that death is something that they shouldn't really care about because it all ends after you die anyway. Things like end of life planning doesn't seem very attractive to people because it focuses your attention even more on death and is not something that people want. But secondly, it probably also makes people less caring about others around them who are experiencing things like grief and death, because they're probably reacting ways that was like, why do you even worry about that? Why do you even want to send your grandma to palliative care? It doesn't matter anyway. Second of all, some people will probably over-focus on death and things like death avoidance. They probably don't care about other aspects of their lives anymore because they think that avoiding death is the primary thing. Because they are constantly reminded of how scary death is, they'll probably not choose things like having palliative care because they do not want to focus on things like comfort, and they rather focus on avoiding death. Very proud to oppose.
Great, I'd like to thank Ella for a fine speech. DPM whenever you're ready.
Can people hear me?
Yeah, perfectly audible.
That's good. Starting in 3, 2, 1. At the end of that speech, I truly do not understand what the margin of opening opposition is. It is probably true that on either side, people are already biologically programmed to fear death. It is true that on either side, the media already sensationalizes death. I.e., if you look at the media right now, lots of characters die in movies due to things like shock accidents. Lots of media focuses on the coverage of death. The meaningful difference of this motion, though, is not focusing on actually the shock cases of death, because the shock cases, by definition, are unusual, unexpected, and therefore do not highlight the salience of death. The meaningful difference is, under our side, we talk about death that is more natural, that the death that comes to individuals eventually, death that is not necessarily always talked about. And I think when opening opposition says that the media will do this badly, they are essentially relying on the status quo. Yes, in the status quo, the media does this badly, but that is because they only focus on one conception of death rather than the alternate conception of death. I first want to start off by giving some argumentation as to why the media will do this usually in a positive way. The first reason as to why this is true is because people understand that death is serious, and most of media does not want to piss off individuals by depicting it really poorly. That is, if you're talking about natural death and you piss off a bunch of people who probably have had family members die, you're probably going to lose popularity. And secondly, this is where their race to the bottom argument plays in, because under their side, it is a race to the bottom argument, because media is usually portraying things like fiction and things that seem distant from individual lives. So they think they can do whatever the fuck they want. But under our side, when this is so close to individual lives, they understand that they cannot possibly do bad things or do it in a way that's going to piss people off. Secondly, it is oftentimes in the incentive of the media to differentiate themselves from their competitors. All of their arguments that say currently the media focuses so much on gruesome deaths means that any other additional gruesome death is probably not going to earn you that much money, because why would you want to read or watch another gruesome death that is happening? That means that there's more focus on things that people have not discussed before but are still relevant to individual lives. I think a good example I want to highlight is books like Tuesdays with Morrie, which I don't know how many people have read, but nonetheless, it talks about death in a very natural manner. It talks about what people should do in the face of death. And because of the fact that other individuals have not talked about it previously, it gained a lot of traction. Thirdly, even if it were true that some media are likely to do this in a bad way, what Enting told you is that there's a wide variety of shows and a wide variety of experts that talk about death. This is not just about like movies, it's also about like people like medical experts talking about what you should do in the face of death. And eventually there's going to be some level of selection where people are like, oh, I relate to that conception of death. And therefore, over time, even if you start out badly, you're likely to correct over time. The meaningful contribution here I want to make is that I think Elo is right to point out that this is kind of similar to sex positivity within the media. Obviously, when media first started portraying sex, they did it in sensationalizing and bad ways, but over time they corrected because they knew that their viewers cared about it. Fourthly, even if they do it poorly, I think what's important in the PM case is the fact that people talk about it. Maybe people do it poorly, but nonetheless, when you watch a movie with your friends together, or when you read the news with your family and talk about it on the dinner table, you talk about things like, oh, what was so poor about that depiction? What are some things I relate to and what are some things I do not relate to? That sparks conversation that does not happen under their side. So that means that all of our claims on why death being a taboo is bad is flipped under their side. This deals with most of their characterization because all of their arguments rely on the media doing it very, very poorly. Finally, just a point on their religion claim, I just do not understand the margin here. Religion sticks onto any kind of media narrative and try to convince people on the basis of it. Not sure why death is the one that they're likely to fixate on. The second thing I want to rebut is with respect to their claims that say people are going to have bad reactions to death. The problem with their argumentation is that I don't think they ever explain why things like having a nihilistic reaction or why things like death avoidance is a bad thing. There's actually no impacting in their argumentation as to why these choices made by people are terrible, bad things. I want to make two contributions here. The first thing is with respect to having a nihilistic reaction, two responses. The first is that just because there's going to be an end to something doesn't mean people suddenly think the process doesn't matter. There's always an end to a semester. There's always an end to a tournament. That doesn't mean that I think that the process does not matter. So it's unlikely that people are going to have this nihilistic reaction. Secondly, even if it were the case some people do have a nihilistic reaction, I think it's perfectly legitimate for each individual to assess the situation for themselves. That is, if I see what the perspective of death is and decide that it's fine to live life in a nihilistic manner, that is a choice that I make for myself. And that's an entirely legitimate choice. Opening opposition cannot demonize that as a bad choice. Secondly, opening opposition talks about death avoidance. Firstly, the margin of this argument is unclear. Enting already told you about why people still have a fear of death, regardless of whether the media media talks about it or not. The meaningful difference is, one, that fear decreases under our side, because at least for some individuals, it becomes more exposed and normalized. But secondly, like, once again, if some individuals see the media and decide that death avoidance is the way to go, why is that a bad thing? I think what we do under our side is make sure that each and every individual is portrayed and is given the best options that are out there, the chance to discuss those options and live life the way that they want to live it. That's what's missing on opening opposition. Before I go on, I'll take a POI from closing. Cool. I gave them an opportunity to engage. They did not. The second thing, the final thing I want to talk about is with respect to what are the positive impacts this has with respect to individual life. And I want to be clear, for the individuals who want to engage in whatever they want, they're probably likely to do that on either side. The meaningful difference is, for the people who are scared of death, for the people who want to talk about it, what changes? The problem is that when end-of-life situations come, when people go to hospitals with their family, what happens in the status quo is that when they're given things like the diagnosis of death, people are irrational. These are emotions that they face for the first time. And as a result of this, they are in denial, they are in refusal. They tell the doctor that this is not true. They tell individuals that you should still fight. The problem is that when people die eventually, each family member is filled with remorse and regret without the ability to change anything about it, because the person has already died. And all you have done for the past 10 days or 10 weeks that were the last moments of one's life is just fight about it and be emotional about it. That changes under our side of the house, because these discussions are sparked earlier in society. Families and friends already talk about this. People already do things like planning for the end of life. And here's where we co-opt opening opposition's analysis that says people do not want to do this. The weighing of this argument is very clear. It is only under our side that, one, we uniquely do this. All of their arguments are probably true of anything that the media depicts. But secondly, we are the side that makes sure that people do not have any regrets that they cannot fix within their lives. They cannot possibly access that choice. We're extremely proud to stand on government.
Great. I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his very fine speech. I invite dialogues to end the top half.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly so.
Okay, POIs in the chat exclusively, please. I want to start by describing the counterfactual on our side. Opening government pushes two counterfactuals on us. The first one is that media narratives are saturated by conceptions of death with gruesome violence and sensationalism, and that is the status quo. I want to make two different observations about this. First, it is not true. On the whole, media narratives avoid graphic depictions of death or strong amounts of time focused on the experiences of death in the lives of individuals. In fact, the media strays away from discussion of death for three reasons. First, because things like gruesome depictions of death cause media disengagement in the status quo. This is because people have strong incentives to avoid suffering and contemplating death due to the very taboo that opening government describes. The fact that there is a taboo around discussing death, the fact that people do not wish to contemplate it in their lives, is a strong disincentive for the current media to cover death in any particular way. Second, because people often view media as an opportunity to disengage from stresses in their lives. That means when there's a competition among different media institutions, you're more likely to pick the show in the status quo that has a less gruesome or lacks a depiction of death, because that's an easier way for you to not think about your own life. Furthermore, people like writers often try to avoid contemplating death themselves. People like actors do not wish to play characters who die precisely due to the taboos that opening government identifies. Third of all, even if this depiction of death happens, media institutions often put a lot of effort into separating the depictions of death in the media from the lives of everyday individuals. That is, when it shows death, it emphasizes that this is a fictional character, that this is a happenstance that is unlikely to affect you. And indeed, opening government's arguments rely on this being true, because if people already view media depictions of death as part of their everyday lives, maybe death to some extent is already salient for them. The reality is that the media intentionally frames even the gruesome or awful depictions of death that opening government wants to push on us as something that is not likely to happen to you. What that means is you don't alter your life decisions or your perception of something like a death in your family or in your own life based on what you view in the media and the status quo, and that changes in opening government's world. The second counterfactual that opening government puts on us is the experience of death in people's personal lives being extraordinarily sudden. It is true that people experience death in their daily lives, but precisely the fact that death is really proximate to people means it's unlikely to be that sudden. Most people have had many family members die or gone to a funeral or had communities suffer death. The distinction is we would much rather that communities control the discussion about what happens in the immediate aftermath of death, being prepared beforehand by a media that even in its broadest coverage is extraordinarily general and does not apply to the specific circumstances of individuals could make these discussions of death really unrepresentative rather than preparing them for these tragedies. But we would also like a world where people are able to move on from these tragedies, not center death in their lives even after these tragedies happen and become desensitized. The first question I want to ask is whether people engage with this media at all. Remember, the premise of the opening government case is that when this so-called universal media centers discussions about the salience of death, people continue engaging with said media. And while it is true that the media has incentives to create engagement, the fear of death does not change on either side of the house per DPM's own admission. In fact, even though the fear of the unknown is part of the fear of death, there is likely substantial fear of death that causes people to disengage from the media institutions that are talking about death in Gov's world on their side. There are three reasons this fear of death is so substantial that discussions about the salience of death, even if presented in a positive way, cause people to turn off the television, disengage from media. First, because we are evolutionarily programmed to fear death. The people who are most likely to fear death are also the ones who avoided it throughout their lives and had large amounts of children, meaning the fear of death is genetically programmed into us. Second, death is the end of our proximate experiences. Especially due to capitalism, our visions of happiness are often tied to the experiences we have in life rather than existing, and you know that the end of those experiences means you fear death. Third, no amount of information makes death any less unknown because no one knows what happens after you die. All of this contributes to a crippling fear of death, meaning when media institutions even approach it in a slow or careful way, people want to avoid thinking about it. Either they've gone through trauma already, or they will in the future and want to avoid discussions around it. So even if discussions to some extent happen due to the universality of media, people opt out of media institutions that discuss this. This is logically prior to anything in the debate, because whether people watch media that emphasizes death at all is the premise of OG's argument. But there are also functional purposes of this kind of media. There are news media, media about people's health information, television shows that involve death. You instead pick much more casual forms of media that are much less informative for your lives. Second question, though, is engaging with the media good for people's lives? The first claim that they give us is that the media does not want to piss people off who've had family members die, and therefore the media will be accountable. But our case is not that the media will be extreme in how badly it represents death. Rather, as I'm going to explain, the mere representation of death in the way that opening government wants is likely to create substantially worse lives for people. Let's engage their case. They say the lack of discussion makes death substantially fearsome when it does happen. I want to make a couple of observations about this. One, they assume media institutions make people's information about death good, that they actually prepare them well, that they encourage them to plan for their lives in good ways. They don't prove this assumption. Firstly, religious institutions have substantial amounts of control over the media because for a lot of people, faith is everything. However, religions in the status quo avoid talking about death altogether to avoid disengaging people. When it captures the media narratives around death, they are often centered around notions like the afterlife or what religion can do to help support you through death that can be extraordinarily coercive. Second, the media intentionally misinforms you about death. Not in a way that makes you angry, so all DPM's incentives about media institutions don't apply, but rather either to make it more relatable to an ordinary individual, they emphasize the possibility that they might die rather than focusing on things like elderly individuals dying, and they focus on the types of death that are fundamentally more interesting. What this means is people are misinformed about what their death might be like. Finally, they say you are more likely to prioritize what you think is the good life and live a meaningful life. But people simply time discount a lot more when the media shoves them with false information about the possibility of them dying in their daily lives that frames every single decision that they make. Finally, on how this affects vulnerable people in society, they talk about the normalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia. But I actually think this contributes to substantial pressure that already exists among healthcare systems to free up capacity for people to give up. That means societies invest less in palliative care and people are worse off. Oppose.
Great. I'd like to thank Diallo for the fine speech and all speakers on top. It's been a great debate so far. Remember to take POIs, they're very fun. Member of government whenever you're ready.
I'm audible, right?
Yeah, perfectly so.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. As every Bulgarian ever, we're just going to talk about money and companies exploiting people when they're most vulnerable. First, before that, let's engage with the case that's coming from opening opposition. The gist of it is that in many cases, the media is going to give unnuanced, uncharacteristics, unrepresentative, and sensational takes because like they have those incentives. Let's comprehensively refute them and explain and mechanize why there are incentives for you to do this in a good way. I'm just going to bite the bullet. If the media is so sensational and it wants to like maximize its profits, it's not clear why it's going to use specifically those types of interviews and articles. In the vast majority of cases, for example, New York Times or like the Wall Street Journal have sensational articles about political debates or like celebrity gossips, but they're still having long-form, thoughtful and nuanced articles by guest posts. So it's unclear why this will be their source of maximizing profits and why that in particular they're going to essentialize. Secondly, they themselves make a contradiction because if this makes you feel uncomfortable and they want to maximize their profits, then necessarily speaking, they have to do this in a way that makes you feel comfortable. That is to say, it has to give sensitive and nuanced takes necessarily. Secondly, in the vast majority of cases, medias, to maximize their profits for people to subscribe to them and to read their articles, wish to appear as sensitive, impartial, and objective, which necessarily means that in the vast majority of cases, they invite people who have legitimacy or are experts in the field, which means when you're talking about dying, in the vast majority of cases, you're likely to invite nurses and doctors that have actively assisted people prior to dying, who can best express the different ways in which people cope with dying, the process that they're actively going through, because they're the only people who have continuously been there to make different views. Thirdly, they say they're not going to be representative of different nuances. And here is the contradiction. They say we rather have personal, individualistic, or communal alternatives. But why would they be nuanced? The people in their communities or in their own individual views tend to exist in echo chambers. They have one specific cultural, ideological, or like religious interpretation of what it is to die. Why wouldn't the media, that as they themselves concede, has a profit incentive to attract as many demographics as possible, present different interpretations that you can actively compare and conceptualize to maximize their profits, and have different and nuanced takes to attract as many people as possible as compared to their individualistic alternative? Now, secondly, they say this is going to make you feel actively horrible. Here is a very like realistic way of like viewing this debate. In the vast majority of cases, people don't have an existential fear of dying. This is so because firstly, in our everyday life, we're just too preoccupied with like debating, unfortunately, working, being stressed. Secondly, in many cases, people are just not thinking because they fall into automatic routines, habits, and schedules, which necessarily means that they're not even conceptualizing dying. But thirdly, many more proximate emotions, like for example, anger at this emotion because I don't understand it, frustration, excitement, love, happiness, ground you in the present, which necessarily means this is not a debate about people just existentially feeling horrible every single day. It is about people being targeted in specific moments. What are those specific moments? I would say those are the moments in which you are reminded of your own inevitable mortality. That is to say, you are either sick, like seriously sick, or trivially sick. Like for me, for example, when I get trivially sick, I think I'll die. Secondly, people close to your friends and relatives being very sick or dying, or generally speaking, thirdly, people getting older, realizing they are mortal because they're like they look different, they mentally feel different, which necessarily means it triggers you in moments in which you are very vulnerable, right? Why are you very vulnerable? Let's just borrow the analysis from Tejas. You cannot conceptualize dying, right? Like people describe dying as resting in peace. Like this is a very humanistic and emotional way to describe it because we just cannot conceptualize it. If you cannot visualize dying, you are more likely to tend towards the negative, right? To have irrational and excessively negative interpretations of dying, which means if you are if you are a human being, you are suffering, right? You have negative emotions. You want to quench those negative emotions. So, and this is like the only like realistic analysis, but what are you going to do in a moment of vulnerability when you have an existential fear of dying? You're going to start Googling things. You're going to start like searching for solutions. Hey, can I prolong not dying? What measures can I actively take not to die? And this is where it gets really fun. This is where companies step in. Two mechanisms. Firstly, in the vast majority of cases, prior to the existence of this narrative, many companies are doing market affiliation for their products and services by making informative content. They're basically telling you, oh, those are healthy ways for you to extend your life, to avoid dying, maybe even get immortal, because some freaks are fucking like insane and are promoting alternative medicine. So they're sneaking in the market affiliation in informative content that you are likely to stumble upon. This is the first mechanism. The second one is, in many cases, people are not educated about privacy, right? They don't understand it. They don't care about it. It's so convoluted. They cannot protect themselves. Or secondly, companies are either massively lobbying or are hard to regulate, which means they have massive intrusions upon your privacy, which means just Googling, hey, can I avoid like dying or like delay it, etc., necessarily means that you are more prone to be experienced targeted advertisements much after like the initial moment of anxiety that you're actively experiencing, which necessarily means that this targets vulnerable people at their very weakest when they're dying from existential fear, etc., to actively be coerced to like purchase things. Now, how does this thing counterbalance that? The first broad thing is that if you have on aggregate more media interviews, articles that is actively contesting for the first page of Google results, or likely you are likely to stumble upon it on the internet and in social media. But secondly, regardless of whether this is done in a good or a bad way, you just, if it's continuously done, if it's done more, then this actively means you're confronting it more. Like people psychologically, irrespective of whether this is a good or bad thing, when something continuously happens, they just start to cope with it, which necessarily means that irrespective of how it's done, but I'm saying it's going to be done in a good way, you are still able to normalize. Before I continue, yes, open.
If companies have large amounts of lobbying power and resources to capture the media and use targeted advertisements, wouldn't they capture media institutions to frame your depictions of death to make people really fearful so they buy these companies' products?
But this is not comparative, because they're doing it in the present already. Against, we have, even if in our worst case, we have 30% better capacity to make it in a better way, this necessarily means that this is better. But secondly, not all media companies are profit maximizing, or as I have already said, in that specific way. Okay, so why is this impactful? Firstly, you are likely to buy ineffective or actively harmful products and services. If you're desperate to increase your life, there is a whole fucking industry with supplements for longevity that is firstly hijacking the prices because it knows you're desperate. Secondly, tying the efficiency of one product to another product, basically telling you that you have to all buy them in bulk to actively ensure that you extend your lifespan. Thirdly, it is telling you to continue to use them for over the long term. Otherwise, the effect won't be effective. This is very problematic because you're wasting a shit ton of money, and this is the only tangible thing in the debate. But secondly, this is problematic because you're likely to turn to alternative medicine and more experimental things. That is to say, like gene manipulation, other surgeries, because you irrationally fear that, and you are more likely to be responsible. And so, for all those reasons, pause.
I'd like to thank the member of government for the fine speech. Member of opposition, whenever you're ready.
If you have TLIs, please just offer them in the chat. Opening opposition does a good job of trying to tell us why the media is bad. But where I think that they are really lacking is an explanation of how we form conceptions and understandings of death on the comparative. Our extension on closing opposition is very simple. Individuals are best equipped to reach their own introspection and understanding about what death, mortality, and the afterlife means to them. And the process of media depiction is going to harm the ability for me to find the understanding that is best suited toward myself. Clash is going to be integrated. The first thing that I want to establish is illustrate the process of how people think about death under our side of the house. Because opening government functionally says that death is so stigmatized under the status quo, we are simply not going to talk about death on the comparative. And I think that this is strategically damaging to opening opposition, because at the end of top half, we're comparing a world where death is stigmatized, but we don't talk about it very much, versus on a low, possibly bad conversations. And it's kind of hard to weigh up which one of these two things are worse. There's a couple important reasons why we're still going to talk, conceptualize, and destigmatize death under the status quo.
world. The first thing to say is that as humans, we always need to plan for the next stage of life, and therefore we are fundamentally forward-looking beings. I need to think about the university that I'm going to go to, then I'm going to think about my job, then I'm going to think about my retirement, then I do what I have to think about my will. This is particularly true because the vast majority of people have a child, and therefore you have to think about death because you want to make sure that the child is going to be cared for, especially if you die early, which is why you do things like establish wills. The second observation to make is that most people in their lives have unfortunately lost someone. You've gone through the grief and the pain of that. And as a consequence, you did have conversations with your friends, your families, and your loved ones to try and process that person's death. And it's hard to confront the fact that death is going to happen because you've experienced it yourself within your own quality of life. Therefore, given they're also going to think about death, under our side of the house, we like you to get individualized understandings about what death actually means. It's very important that we get individualized understandings because not everyone's going to benefit from conceptualizing death in the same way. First, we just have different personalities and different psychological makeups, but secondly, and more importantly, we have different lived experiences relating to death in our own lives. If I have disproportionately lost family members who I love, I want to believe that most individuals are going to heaven. If I've disproportionately lost people who have a friend from me and who harmed me, I want to believe that people are going to hell. If I've lost a combination of people, I might want to believe in a more individualized conception of the afterlife rather than just a conventional understanding of what heaven and hell actually means. I think individuals can come to this process in healthy ways, and here I'm going to respond to closing government. I think that the first way that this happens is just thinking and introspecting about it as like an individual being, right? I don't think that this happens in like a panicked way where you randomly search on the internet, given that it's a pretty like drawn out process, right? It's not like a shock thing where you're like, wow, I'm going to die, right? This is something you're often confronted with at multiple stages and at multiple thoughts under the status quo because you are thinking about things like your kids, your retirement, and your wills. So it is a more like rational process that is going to ultimately exist. I also just reject their claim that most people have a negativity bias. I think if anything, I would counter-assert the opposite, that most people have an optimism bias, given thinking happy thoughts makes us happier, and therefore our brain is kind of predisposed to like create more serotonin when we're thinking optimistic thoughts. Even if the response is going on the internet more, I don't even think that this is a bad counterfactual, and it's probably better than the media. If you're reading things like Quora pages and like Reddit threads and how people process grief, given that people process grief differently, if you're Googling things, you're still going to be exposed to multiple perspectives that are going to exist. I think the second way of how we process things under the status quo is just talking to our family and our friends and our loved ones. These are often productive conversations because they know what our emotional triggers are. They've often lost someone who they also love, right? It's a shared memory, and therefore you are sympathetic in these kinds of conversations. I know that we like to shut on parents in debating, but if like your grandparents have passed away, they're going to say like, don't worry, honey, you're going to go to heaven at the end of the day. Given all of this framing, we came from healthy understandings of death. Before I talk about how the media ruins this process, I would love to engage with opening government.
Leaving aside opening opposition's own analysis why people do actively avoid thinking about death, introspection is better when continually done through discussions with family and friends when sparked by the media, rather than processing it only when you're grief-stricken.
Okay, so the problem is when you have conversations based on the media, the conversations deviate toward the media narrative. I'm going to explain why that narrative is bad. Also, crucially, we are not knifing because the other case is that the media does not otherwise talk about death. Their claim is obviously we still think about death. That was literally like the first 3 minutes of LO was reasons why people think about death still, and that's really, really bad and damaging for people. So like even if DLO knifes LO, which is probably true, we're just like going with the LO conception of what ends up happening in this debate. Why do I think that the media is ultimately harmful? So rather than an individualized conception, the media narratives that exist tend to force more people to understand death based on what the media is telling them, both on the individual level, where you are continually processing similar narratives over time, and I'll explain why the narratives are similar, but also on the external level, where more individuals expect you to process grief based on like the character who they adore within a particular television show. I think O's claim about shocking things is not the best because the DLO already refutes this by being like shocking things are like damaging for people and like agrees with it. There's two other problems that exist. The first, that the media tends to be necessarily majoritarian in nature. Most media, unlike what Bizzer says, is profit motivated because that's a media that tends to get elevated toward the top because they have more advertising revenue to be able to spread their message, like globally expand and set up new corporations. Given that media is majoritarian, they often want to tell a variety of stories that appeal to what they perceive the majority of people within society already believe in. So for example, death being portrayed as a dark man within a cloak, very conventional understandings of heaven and hell. Things like someone who's going through chemotherapy being like a strong survivor, even if they're feeling depressed and they just want to ultimately cry inside. So they appeal toward majoritarian conceptions that then make it harder for individuals to deviate from that. But our second observation here, and this is crucial, media depictions disproportionately trend toward nihilism. I think the top half is confusing because, oh geez, like some people are not going to find meaning. Oh, it's like some people are going to be nihilists. What matters is not how people respond to it, which is hard to adjudicate. What matters is which of the two narratives the media chose to display in characters. We see that the media is going to show more nihilism than positive approaches toward reaching meaning. This is for two structural reasons. Firstly, nihilism is perceived to be the narrative that more people are relating to under the status quo. The reality is a lot of people are just not doing too well. COVID has been horrible for individuals. There's a mental health epidemic that currently exists. Most like meme pages right now are like crippling nihilism and like nihilist meme pages rather than like pages about how we can find like meaning and understanding in our own life. Therefore, it appears to be a more marketable narrative. But secondly, it is easier to build a storyline around nihilism than finding meaning after death. Why? If the storyline is about nihilism, this doesn't have to encompass the entirety of your plot. It can just be like BoJack Horseman or like Rick and Morty being like, fuck, I want to die, like I'm really depressed, and like a one-liner thing. Whereas if you're showing people taking up things from like their bucket list, this has to take up a large part of the plot, which might ruin the plot line that you actually want and make it harder to differentiate your media from other institutions. So nihilism is a far more profitable narrative. Why then is nihilism bad? Firstly, it is really fucking triggering for people. Like if you are someone who has suicidal thoughts, is depressed, or has recently lost someone, you often want media to be your escape outlet. But it's harder to access that when you're constantly being bombarded by nihilist media. But secondly, it does make you feel depressed, right? OG tries to be like, but like the process can be valuable. But the process doesn't seem valuable if you're going to die, or you can reap the benefits of what that process is. And if you're finally happy and find the passion in your life that is ultimately going to end. We can still construct meaning by things that reward us, that bring us toward joy, but nihilism gets so much worse. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in closing opposition.
Great. I'd like to thank the member of opposition's fine speech. Government Whip to summarize the proposition bench whenever you're ready.
Hi, I presume you can hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Cool. Pew-wise in chat. Yeah, I'll take one from opening at 5, just a sec. Okay. 3, 2, 1. I think you can tell Bisser is a communist, and I'm just going along with it because we love nothing more than to shit on companies. Few things on this. Firstly, comparing their openings. 1, they receive a lot of pushbacks from both oppositions about why there is always some sort of discussion about that anyways, and they themselves are like conceding to a large extent, and they have a lot of pushback on you going to a funeral, someone on your family dying. It is very intuitive that this likely happens, so the characterization of this being taboo is very uncharitable and realistic. This is something that you have to know. Once we're better able to explain why this is universally better to get counterbalance to what people do with their lives and what they're pushed to do and coerced to do, this is better mechanization on their own argument about why we counterbalance certain narratives. Because not what they prove is that you have more discussion at the dinner table about how to cope with that and certain things like this. But it's unclear why you don't already have this to the point that they receive pushback from both oppositions about why you either have seen people die and you've already learned to do so, or secondly, just generally there's discussion about it among the people within your family. But secondly, even if they're correct, I think we'll be able to prove to you a way greater, a more vulnerable kind of impact. Because even if people are better able to deal with this and kind of to talk about it better, I think it's way more important that even if less more people are counterbalanced to the extent that they do not coerce or pushed to do things that they necessarily don't want, such as go to painful surgeries and go to chemotherapy, even though they know they won't get better. This is infinitely more important in terms of vulnerability of the characters, or secondly, about the number of people that we are likely going to impact. But secondly, it's just more long-term in terms of impact. If we're better able to prove to you that life-changing decisions are made, if you don't have a way to counterbalance them, this is extremely dangerous, then this goes over them in terms of how impactful this case is. Great. Let's go to 001. There is a great deadlock within opening cap about how this narrative is pushed, whether or not it's good or not. I think Mr. gives you sufficient reasons as to why this is like even above OG as to why those narratives are likely to be good. But here's the thing. I think our case goes over, even if kind of it's not always the best. But here's a few reasons as to why, more statutory reasons as to why. Articulator. 1, you have a lot of call out from experts, especially when it is within the media. Not that there is a rise on experts being on platforms such as TikTok, Instagrams, or just general all medias overall, which means that you can call out unreasonable interpretations of this narrative in the sense that you are have a lot of audiences and you can quickly go viral with those things. Secondly, we give you a lot of just incentives that are intuitive by OO's case on their own. They say this narrative shifts people's ability to think about death, and that's why it's still profitable for you to show shocking death, but you don't fundamentally change human nature. People still are probably disgusted by death and don't always love to talk about it. So media is unlikely to do this in the charitable way that they presume by their own analysis, right? Because if they do care for profit, and if it is that bad and that traumatizing and that just generally hurtful to people, media will stop doing it to the point that see that people are disengaging within media. I think this is highly intuitive and non-strategic to run from OO. Secondly, though, note what we proved to you is that currently there's a lot of alternative ways for people to explain them, and all themselves say religions, right, and communities, and that this is good. I would close it. It is way worse to have those decentralized meanings of that in certain ways. Why? One, they can become way more radical. It is at the point where you don't have such a centralized idea that religions can exploit the idea of hell and heaven and exploit people and coerce them either to join into their religion or do active stuff that doesn't benefit them, such as donate, spend time, or in the most extreme case, do some stuff to sacrifice themselves in cults and all those things. Maybe this doesn't change all those sorts, but it is to the point which that all teams in this debate engage and can see that people consume a lot of media. It's to the point at which we are able to at least counterbalance this to an extent that people can think about what they're doing and have an active other opinion to hear rather than being isolated within their own bubbles. Secondly, why is this extremely important? Why is it better to have this alternative? I think what they do say, in the sense of you being unhappy, is extremely unimpacted, right? Because what they do say is you make some bad decisions about who, like, do you take palliative care or not? I would say this is actually one on our side, because palliative care is about you just living the best possible life at the end of your death, right? Because death is inevitable, whereas their comparative is going through surgeries that can alter your life, trying to fight cancer and such life-threatening diseases in the way that it doesn't actively continue your life. The palliative care is being on death support until your death. It's not about trying to prevent that death. What then happens on their side of the house is that you coerce people more so to take those kind of very painful surgeries and experiences on that side. It looks like you being forced to go to chemotherapy and losing your hair, being emotionally weak, not being able to spend time with your family because you cannot physically get up, because those treatments are extremely harmful and painful to every single person. The point is, they say, oh, you don't fight for your life. I would say to the point at which you feel like you cannot live anymore, and to the point at which you don't feel there is a purpose for you to live anymore, it is good to allow people to do that choice. OG say this, but never mechanized as to why people are coerced to do the opposite on either side of the house, where they're forced to live with their unbearable circumstances, where they cannot feel better. And no, why is it that they cannot get better, especially in those circumstances? Either one, medicine is not as advanced to the extent that we can fix such long-lasting diseases, and it just forces people to be hurt and struggle for 2 more years where they're extremely vulnerable. Or secondly, when they're in such a mental state, they're coerced by doctors and companies to take those opportunities, lose the money that they can give to their family or to themselves to live a good ending of their life in the last few years. Before I continue,
GovBench depends on people engaging with this media. Fear of death means they either entirely disengage or their lives get worse when society defunds chemo for anyone who wants it and people are stripped of purpose.
I think, firstly, if you do proof in disengagement, I think if media, as per your own characterization, care for profit, they will not do this in such a bad way. But secondly, even if media engage, I think, again, you can still inevitably see the media even if you don't want to. You see it on the TV when it randomly plays in the restaurant. You see it on your phone because you're not an animal and go out of social media. It's extremely uncharitable on their side. Let's weigh this out. At worst, they have some people who do not fight for their life, where it's unclear whether or not they will be successfully able to do so. On our side, we have less people coerced into decisions that they do not want to make to at least certain extent. Lastly, with CEO. One, I think what they do is it's good for you to create your own perception of that. I think my responses to see all here apply as well. It's bad to allow this for communities such as that are isolated to do so, because you're more likely to opt into alternatives that are worse for you. Religion pushing the idea of hell or heaven is actively harmful to the extent that it coerces you either in this religion, which takes away your own dignity as a human being, or secondly pushes you to things that are not good for you financially or emotionally. But secondly, I think what a lot of the things is, one, you can still make some sort of your own interpretations of this narrative by virtue of seeing just more discussions of it. You can make your opinion on this. Secondly, though, comfort, I think, is greater on our side when you believe that you have no control over whether or not your grandmother died, which allows you to deal with this grief even better, thus fulfilling their own burden on this side. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Government Whip for the very fine speech and invite Opposition Whip to summarise Opposition bench and end the debate as a whole.
Hi, everyone. I will take a POI closer to the 5-minute mark, and I prefer if you say it out loud around then. The first thing I want to talk about is how people individually find meaning and whether or not this is possible in the status quo. Then I'm going to talk about why media ought to be an avenue for happiness and escapism, and this shifts that. And then last of all, I'll deal with extraneous things from closing Gov. First, on the question from opening Gov. And I think the problem with the OG framing is just that it's all too convenient. It says right now, media does not ever approach this narrative. It doesn't ever promote moral salience. It does nothing that ever tries to approach or approximate these norms. And instead, what we fiat with this motion is relatively good and nuanced discussion that explains the meaning of death. I think it equally is true, and I can simply counter assert, and it's probably much more plausible, to say that right now media does sometimes try to portray mortal salience because there are many different plot lines and diversity in media, a line that CG actually directly says themselves when they're trying to say that there are many different portrayals of death that you can choose from and you won't have this forced down your throat. So I think in the cases where we get these simplistic or bad narratives or conceptions around media, that could also just equally as well be media flailing around trying to portray moral salience because different forms of media have different ideas. OG gives us no conclusive reason why if lots of media do this, it will end up equalizing around good forms of discussion. Notice how this clashes with Naomi's analysis. The analysis was that simple narratives are going to be encouraged if you're a producer of media, whether that be nonfiction media or fictional media. The reason why is that the way you make money in media is by differentiating yourself in some type of unique way from what conventional coverage is. And the problem is that nuance and complexity in your plot and having the plot of your show or of the opinion piece in your article being focused around death and running lots of articles on the same topic is that you then can't differentiate yourself from the consensus. You want to retain creative control and have something unique. And that is a reason why you're likely to, when the motion comes in basically and says there's now a mandate for media to promote mortal salience, do it in the ways that are least costly to your own ability to profit and advance. And that's why you're going to get simplistic, easy narratives that tie into majoritarian consensuses that people already buy into. The stuff that Naomi flags about how people are probably structurally incentivized to be increasingly nihilistic. This does two things. Number one, it points out why, because it's going to reinforce the majoritarian norms that are very strong, people probably won't resist this very well. So it's not like they'll choose from a menu of options and decide which type of media portrayal best maps onto their own experience. Second of all, if they were good at deciding which media portrayals map onto their own experience, they wouldn't need to because they're already good at introspection, so their policy would be redundant. But the third thing that it does is it engages with the better CG response that OG doesn't give, which is that in response to OO, who are, I guess, trying to win the debate by saying nothing happens because no one even listens to this media for some reason, which I think is, relatively implausible when CG comes back and is like, well, they probably still want to make money because it shows why the profit incentive for media to still make money means that they will try to do it, but they're in some way going to be bad at it due to this prisoner's dilemma that I've described of media competition. So that is the more accurate characterization of the way in which media competition tries to approximate this narrative. How do we find meaning on our side of the house and why is it important? CG has an interesting response here. They say that at best, what their policy can do is make people more aware of death, and that can spur discussion among people. I think the problem is that they never actually demonstrate the unique utility of this discussion compared to the people's own capacity to introspect. Look at the weird circularity on closing Gov. Their whole reason for why media portrayals are good, which again, as I flagged, fills in the link that OG missed, is that people care a lot about death, so they're going to demand nuanced portrayals, so the market is going to give it to them. But if people have pretty nuanced conceptions of what death is, that also implies that they're relatively good at introspection and that they won't have the harms that CG says are associated with them. They probably won't go buy supplements or try to adjust their genes or, whatever the actual constructive component of the CG extension on that area ends up being. So it ends up relying on a mechanism that they say is not true, that people are unnuanced and likely to accept bad media, which I think is probably not the case. Is that OG? I'll take it.
Yeah, media incentives to differentiate will promote unique conceptions of death, and this expands the range of possible concepts you have access to when you engage in discussion and introspection. On op, individuals will only introspect when prompted by grief, which leads to significantly less considered decisions.
I've already dealt with part of this, which is just that the problem is that the menu is not very large, and it's not a menu that's any better than what people have via their own families or their own experiences. So it's not clear what the benefit is. But second, will it really? Like, I don't think the conceptions of death, given that, as they point out on OO, they'll already be linked in some ways, like how we already celebrate death and think about death, like via religious context, are good. We're probably not portraying like a Muslim funeral on mainstream American media to a very large extent. Even if there are some incentives to differentiate, all it does is get it closer and closer to what people already know about death, or what people are already likely to come to in terms of more accurate conceptions around their family. The best way they could win on this is this really tiny margin that at best this could be sort of a starting off point to have discussions about death or think about death. And this is where I'll bring in the analysis where there's this silly alleged tension between us and OO. The OO analysis is media doesn't talk about death a lot right now because it's stigmatized. They do have a real tension in OO, which is the question of whether or not people are likely to be afraid of death, which Tejas says in DLO, because it's like people don't think about this at all, so they won't watch the media. And then LO has already obviously said that people have large incentives to consider death in the long run for some reason, which may well just be linked to Gao's policy manifesting of the status quo. Naomi fills in the actual links for why this is happening, which is to say that A, people conceptualize of life via stages by necessity. Second of all, that there are going to be lots of material reasons, like the fact that you have children, the fact that you have to plan for retirement, the fact that you have to do your taxes, that are going to motivate people to think about death in useful ways, right? Like when they're in a good mental state, when they want to think about death, and in the moments where they're not looking for comfort. And this brings in the third element of our extension, which is a deadlock breaker on this very question of whether or not media provides happiness or escapism. And the point here was honestly very simple. Even if you accepted OG's case in the best possible scenario for their side, there are some bad portrayals of death. There are some unnuanced portrayals of death. At least, in order for them to have some margin, there are fewer of those things. And they come to dominate media less. And crucially, they're not normative. This is a really important link. It may be true from OG that like sometimes there are news articles that people getting run over by buses, but they're not normative ideas. No one talks about how the person who was run over the bus thought about death or what their religious or cultural values were. That is probably the margin in the motion, right? Is that characters actually talk about their process for understanding death and mortality. And therefore, it is a bit of a ramming down your throat in terms of how you ought to think about things. If religion's not powerful and there are secular societies where young people who are increasingly nihilistic are looking for meaning, this will probably be a dominant way in which people come to understand death. And our simple question on CO is, if given all the Gov analysis, people know themselves fairly well, which is what they use to refute our analysis, and we agree to this very premise, then why would we want media to take away the forms of escapism that we think it provides for right now? Even if on balance you wanted to think about death, even if on balance you wanted to spur these conversations, we pointed out that these were likely anyway. But the problem is people who are sensitive and don't want to be reminded of death all the time, that doing this in media, which is one of the ways in which you can escape from a serious narrative that you're likely to internalize and value anyway when it comes time to your taxes or will, is a good thing. Very proud to oppose.
Great. I'd like to thank opposition whips, fine speech, all debaters for a great debate. Yeah. See you around, I guess. Good luck for advancement.
Thanks for that, everyone. Thanks for judging.